Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, awesome. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janice Kim, and for the past year, I worked with Dr. Augustine Pessoa on a project titled Minority Concentration and COVID-19 Mortality in the United States. So I first want to give some background information, and I'm sure most of you already know, but COVID-19's index case was in Wuhan, China, back in December of 2019. And our first case here in the United States was in the state of Washington in January of 2020. And we saw the quick progression of the spread of the virus. And so by March of 2020, the World Health Organization did declare COVID-19 to be a worldwide pandemic. And because of this, a number of preventative measures took place, and some continue to take place today. So some of these include staying at home, wearing masks, and social distancing. Now, a number of studies have been conducted as the virus continued to infect millions of people. And one topic that came about was the topic of race and how race can impact the likelihood of contracting COVID. And so here I have a couple of points that were made, such as how non-Hispanic African Americans are more likely than non-Hispanic whites to hold essential occupations, and how densely populated areas and cities are more likely to include neighborhoods with a higher share of minority populations. So these points are important because, as we all know, the virus can be transferred from person-to-person contact, and so essential workers are more at risk. And at the same time, those that are living in crowded areas or homes with larger numbers of people are also at higher risk. And usually those that fit these categories are minority populations. So for this project, I decided to focus on that topic of race, and I came up with the research question, is minority concentration linked to COVID-19 mortality? And from this question, 4 hypotheses were formed. So the first is that the Black or African American race has an effect on COVID-19 mortality. The second is that the Asian race has an effect on COVID-19 mortality. The third is that the Hispanic or Latino race or ethnicity has an effect on COVID-19 mortality. And the last is that overall minority concentration has an effect on COVID-19 mortality. So to begin the project, I started by collecting publicly available data, and these were from sources such as the Washington Post, the United States Census Bureau, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and some other sources as well. And data was collected at the state level. So our unit of analysis is the 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia. And I also used the Statistical Analysis Program, SPSS, to analyze the data. And this included testing variables for normality using the examine feature on SPSS, log transforming variables that are found to be non-normal, calculating Spearman correlation coefficients, and performing linear multivariate regression analyses. And here are the results. So for this first table, we are showing the descriptive statistics of all variables, which include the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum and maximum values, and these skewness values. And so high skewness values, such as the one that we see for the percentage Asian population variable, along with the examination of normality plots, led to the log transformation of that variable. And so because of this, all race variables were log transformed. And this is table 2, for which Spearman correlation coefficients were calculated. And we can see that the COVID-19 mortality rate held a positive significant association with the percentage African American population. We can also see some other correlations between the other variables. And these correlations must be identified because for our linear multivariate analyses, we don't want to put independent variables with high correlations together in the same model. For table 3, we're now starting to look at the effects of races on COVID-19 mortality. For example, we can see that the African-American population had an unstandardized coefficient of 19.343. And so for each percentage increase in the percentage African-American population, the COVID-19 mortality rate increases by 19.343% on the log scale. And from this table, the African-American population was the only population of the three that shows significance at the 0.01 alpha level. The Hispanic and Latino population showed significance at the 0.05 alpha level, and the Asian population did not reach significance. So when you consider only the percentage of the racial and ethnic groups, it is suggested that the percentage African-American population seems to play a greater predictive role than the other populations, and that it also strongly affects the COVID-19 mortality rate. For table 4A, the African-American population was isolated and placed into a linear regression model with the other non-population independent variables that we saw from table 1. And we did this to observe in order to observe its effect on COVID-19 mortality. And so taking into consideration these other variables, it is initially suggested that the African-American population is not a significant predictor for COVID-19 mortality. The only variable that reached significance here was the residential segregation index. However, I do attribute this to multi-collinearity, and that's something that I'll go into a little bit later. And for table 4B, the Asian population was also isolated, and a linear regression analysis was performed to see if it predicts COVID-19 mortality. And based on these results, the Asian population did not reach significance. Only the residential segregation index and the Gini coefficient displayed significance. In table 4C, the Hispanic or Latino population was isolated as well. And we can see that it did reach significance along with the residential segregation index. So this table suggests that the percentage Hispanic or Latino population does affect COVID-19 mortality. For the final stage of the analysis, I created a new variable named minority concentration, and that's the sum of the log transformations of the three minority populations. And linear regression analysis shows that minority concentration does not significantly affect COVID-19 mortality, as the only variable that reached significance was the residential segregation index. So the top part of this slide gives us a review of our results, but I did want to go over a couple of some of those results in a bit more detail. So initially, we saw that the percentage African-American population did not affect COVID-19 mortality. But I do want to point out that this may be attributed to the correlations the population had with other variables, like the residential segregation index, the unemployment rate, as well as the Gini coefficient. And to put this into perspective, the residential segregation index has historically had larger consequences for the African-American population. And likewise, for the Gini coefficient, the African-American population does tend to have or experience higher income inequality. And so because of this, I did perform additional linear regression analyses, eliminating those variables. And this did bring the percentage African-American population to significance. To be specific, I removed the Gini coefficient and the residential segregation index, and that led to significance. And removing all three variables also led to significance as well. And I also did this for the minority concentration variable. And I removed the Gini coefficient from the model, and this did lead the minority concentration variable to reach significance as well. There are a couple of limitations to the study that I did want to mention. So first, the analyses were done at the state level. And so this means that our findings may not be generalizable to individuals. The second is that although we did use all US states as well as the District of Columbia, the population size is still too small. And so this likely reduced statistical power. And the third limitation involves controlling for the effect of essential workers, because there is a broad spectrum of essential occupations, for example, being a store clerk to being a physician. This makes it a little bit difficult to render the variable to be a meaningful one. But despite these limitations, this study does add on to ongoing research on minority status and COVID-19 mortality. And it also calls for systemic change. In future research, Dr. Pessoa and I hope to continue this study, and we plan on creating a measure of social disadvantage using principal component analysis. And we're planning on adding up those variables that contributed to multicollinearity and show the percentage African-American population's unique effect. And these are my references, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.